All right, so the lectures I'm going to do this week are probably going to take a little bit longer than what they have because there's so much to establish leading up to the Civil War. And I want to apologize in the advance. I am still recovering from where I had the flu. I have not been this sick in a long time. So I apologize for the scratchy voice and all that kind of stuff. But there is a lot that goes on for you to fully understand how the United States ends up at a civil war. And we've discussed the ways that the North and the South developed differently. And you really do have this industrialization versus agriculture, slave versus free. And there's an idea that should have come up in your readings last week that's called free labor. I think it may have actually come up in the week where we talked about the way industrialization occurred in the North. But free labor is not this idea, obviously, that labor is free. It is this notion that anyone has the right to work. Kind of that self-made man mentality and climbing the ladder of excess. But industrialization paired with free labor did go ahead and create a distinct middle class. And this happens in the North because there is a lack of land and people were forced to work at factories and things like that, which kept the wages very low and most people lived in very harsh conditions. And those ideas did lead to universal male suffrage. And by suffrage, if you're not sure what I'm talking about voting rights. For a long time, you had to be a landowner in order to be able to vote in the United States. We tend to have these notions that everyone could always vote in the U.S., and that's just simply not the case. A lot of men could not vote. Obviously, your slave population could not vote. And as things develop in the North and you have this distinct middle class and there's a lack of land, you see people who are renting apartments who are making a lot of money. So they start questioning this idea of property rights and why you have to have property to be able to vote, that they are maybe managers in factories and things like that. So you do see universal male suffrage pop up. This not only influenced the way the North and the South developed, but it also created very different visions of what's going to go on in the West. And this is particularly in regard to slavery and actually one of the direct causes of the Civil War. So we're going to look at 4 distinct clashes as we lead up to this. And what happens that causes the United States to go to war. And a lot of this is going to be over what happens in Kansas. And it becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. And I'm sorry, I didn't realize that these slides were in there from last week. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. So Bleeding Kansas, first let's look at John Brown, because John Brown really does become involved in this. Early in his life, he was born around 1800. He was from Connecticut, and his father was a very strict Calvinist. If you're not sure what a Calvinist is a Protestant type of religion in which they believe that God has hand-chosen who is going to go to heaven or hell. That the individual person does not have free will, that God makes this decision. So his father was a strict Calvinist and taught them that slavery was a great sin. His father was a tanner, and he moved his family to the Ohio Western Reserve. And in Brown's mind, his God was full of wrath and justice. He was more like the deity worshipped by the 17th century Puritans. And Brown raised his children with a rod in one hand and the Bible in the other, and that is a quote about him. His first wife died in childbirth. The second wife bore him 13 children. In all, he had 20 kids. But he was a very hardcore abolitionist. And he comes up when we look at Bleeding Kansas. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this was so controversial that a Southern senator beat a northern senator on the Senate floor with a cane over this. And it's all over trying to figure out how to organize the territory in the Louisiana Purchase area. So kind of north of present day Omaha. And they wanted to do, or the Louisiana Purchase, the problem comes north of that region a little bit, so you could pave a way for a transcontinental railroad, which would link California to Chicago. So at that time, that's going to be your west. So that was a way of linking the east and the west. As the transcontinental railroad forms even more, we'll see that link from the Pacific coast to Chicago. But the Compromise of 1850, which you should have read about at this point, failed to satisfy either one. And what that compromise stated was basically at the Mason-Dixon line, you're going to have free to the north and not free to the south. And this kind of goes back, but there was an Illinois senator named Stephen A. Douglas, and he promoted this idea of popular sovereignty. And what popular sovereignty was, the North really felt that the meaning of the Missouri Compromise line was very straightforward. And Douglas thought that each state should choose whether they wanted to be free or not. Rather than having this line that cuts the United States in half, he felt, okay, well, let's look at this and this Kansas territory. Let's let them vote and see what they want to do. Remember, we talked about the Cotton Kingdom and how it expanded. And so you have a lot of people who are in the South who need more land, or maybe even you have people in the North who've decided they want some land, and they start moving to this Nebraska, Kansas territory. And I mean, if you own slaves, you're taking your slaves with you. So that's where this all becomes very controversial. Douglas really thought that Kansas would end up being marked out for slavery because Missouri was so close. So if you have people living in Missouri, they're just going to hop this line over and expand their territory. But the North felt that this went against this compromise and took it very seriously. A lot of Missouri residents did use their proximity to migrate to the new territory. And by 1954, Northerners also started going, and that included one of John Brown's sons. He moved to become a farmer. He also moved to become a soldier on the front lines of the battle over slavery and expansion. 4 more of John's sons joined him, as well as his brother-in-law. However, at this time, John Y. Brown remained in Ohio. And so what we see are what's called border ruffians. So if you're taking notes, that is border ruffians. And these were people that came across the border into Kansas, but they would periodically raid and destroy, sometimes killing abolitionists. In May 23rd, they sacked the town of Lawrence. They leveled the Free State Hotel, tossed abolitionist printing presses into the river. In return, Brown shows up, and he and his sons dragged 5 settlers from their cabins and split their heads open with broadswords. And Brown became a household name after this, and he also became an outlaw. When the elections were held to decide whether Kansas was going to be a slave territory or not, pro-slavery people, and even if they were not settled in Kansas, came from droves all over. And I mean, you don't have the internet, you don't have any means of verifying where these people live. So if you live right there on that border, it's very easy to hop over and try to and be able to vote in an election like this. Documentation for where you're living isn't very easy to come by. So 2 different governments actually emerged over this election when they were held. Pro-slavery people in ended up with an anti-slavery, they ended up saying that anti-slavery men were barred from holding office. They were barred from serving juries. The second of the two governments that emerged were called Free Soilers, and they banned slaves and African Americans from the territory in general. So these Free Soilers, it's not so much that they're necessarily abolitionist, but what they are is they don't want African Americans in that region at all. So it does kind of work to the abolitionist cause, because they're fighting for the same thing. Maybe for different reasons behind that, but they are fighting for the same common cause of not wanting to have slavery in the region, even though those differences vary. John Brown fled from Kansas. In the North, he regrouped, promising to take the cause into, and I quote, Africa itself, which what he meant by that was into the South. And so he sets out and he plans an attack. Instead of encouraging slaves to flee into the mountains or into Canada with the Underground Railroad, he planned for the rapid establishment of a free biracial state in the middle of the Old South. And what he thought was this new free state could then be used as a staging area to further disrupt slavery from within. And we'll kind of see the same mentality emerge with the Civil War once Lincoln is in office. So basically, if he can establish a sovereign state in the middle of the South, he feels that then he can branch out and help. So he plots out, he has a raiding party that is composed of free blacks, runaway slaves, elite college men, some utopian idealists. And at 10 o'clock, the raiders crossed the Potomac River Bridge. And the plan was to capture a night watchman, cut the telegraph wires. Now, the telegraph wires would run right down beside the railroad tracks because it was the easiest place to put those wires. So cut the telegraph wires and proceed then onto the armory at Harper's Ferry, which was where the was basically an arsenal for the military. And he also planned to take the bridge over the Shenandoah and then move west to local plantations to capture slave holders and proclaim to the slaves that they were free. And then he thought those slaves then would in turn join his movement. The first hour was very successful at this. But the problem is whenever you're cutting the telegraph wires, it's right there beside the railroad tracks. There are people kind of watching. So the relief watchman noticed that the night watchman was missing. So what he did was he killed he killed one of the watchmen at the wrong time, or kidnapped him at the wrong time. So the night watchman then in turn notified a local train conductor, which for some odd reason Brown had let through. He didn't stop him. And he notified the authorities then that an insurrection had been accomplished at Harper's Ferry. Arms had actually already been dispersed to local slaves. They had about 150 raiders who held the town hostage, but then 2 companies of local militiamen arrived. After refusing to surrender, Brown ended up losing 2 of his sons. He lost 8 more men, 5 were captured, and a handful actually only escaped with their lives out of this. Brown had a rush trial, and you can kind of look at this map here and kind of see what's going on. Brown had a trial. It was a very quick trial, and he was hung on December 2nd. And one of his parting words was, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I as now think vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." Later, as we get toward the Civil War and into the Civil War, thousands will march into the battlefield singing about John Brown's body. They will look at him as a martyr eventually, and he represents what the Civil War is about. So we will pick up there in the next video.